was located at the airport, and while the tower operators were talking, an Air Guard pilot was running toward an F-51, dragging his parachute, helmet, and oxygen mask. I knew the pilot, and he later told me, "I wanted to find out once and for all what these screwy flying saucer reports were all about." While the F-51 was warming up, the tower operators called ATIC and told them about the UFO and where to look to see it. The people at ATIC rushed out, and there it was, an extremely bright light, much brighter and larger than a star. Whatever it was high, because every once in a while it would be blanked out by the thick, high, scattered clouds that were in the area. While the group of people were standing in front of ATIC watching the light, somebody ran in and called the radar lab at Wright Field to see if they had any radar on the air. The people in the lab said that they didn't have, but they could get operational in a hurry. They said they would search southeast of the field with their RC, send some people over. By the time the ATIC people arrived at the radar lab, the radar was on the air and had a target in the same position as the light that everyone was looking at. The radar was also picking up the Air Guard F-51 and an F-51 that had been scrambled from Wright-Patterson. The pilots of the Air Guard 51 and the Wright-Patterson 51 could both see the UFO, and they were going after it. The master sergeant who was operating the radar called the F-51s on the radio, got them together, and started to vector them toward the target. As the two airplanes climbed, they kept up a continual conversation with the radar operator to make sure they were all after the same thing. For several minutes, they could clearly see the UFO, but when they reached about 15,000 feet, the clouds moved in and they lost it. The pilots made a quick decision. Since radar showed that they were getting closer to the target, they decided to spread out to keep from colliding with one another and to go up through the clouds. They went on instruments, and in a few seconds they were in the cloud. It was much worse than they had expected. The cloud was thick, and the airplanes were icing up fast. An F-51 is far from being a good instrument ship, but they stayed in their climb until radar called and said that they were close to the target. In fact, almost on it. The pilots had another hurried radio conference and decided that since the weather was so bad, they'd better come down. If a UFO or something was in the clouds, they'd hit it before they could see it. So they made a wise decision. They dropped the noses of their airplanes and dove back down into the clear. They circled a while, but the clouds didn't break. In a few minutes, the master sergeant on the radar reported that the target was fading fast. The F-51s went in and landed. When the target faded on the radar, some of the people went outside to visually look for the UFO, but it was obscured by clouds, and the clouds stayed for an hour. When it finally did clear for a few minutes, the UFO was gone. A conference was held at ATIC that afternoon. It included Roy James, ATIC's electronics specialist and an expert on radar UFOs. Roy had been over at the radar lab and had seen the UFO on the scope, but neither the F-51 pilots nor the master sergeant who operated the radar were at the conference. The records show that at this meeting, a unanimous decision was reached as to the identity of the UFOs. The bright light was Venus, since Venus was in the southeast during the mid-morning on March 8, 1950. And the radar return was caused by the ice-laden cloud that the F-51 pilots had encountered. Ice-laden clouds can cause a radar return. The group of intelligence specialists at the meeting decided that this was further proved by the fact that as the F-51s approached the center of the cloud, their radar return appeared to approach the UFO target on the radar scope. They were near the UFO and near ice, so the UFO must have been ice. The case was closed. I had read the report of this sighting, but I hadn't paid too much attention to it because it had been solved. But one day, almost 2 years later, I got a telephone call at my office at Project Blue Book. It was a master sergeant, the master sergeant who had been operating the radar at the lab. He'd just heard that the Air Force was again seriously investigating UFOs, and he wanted to see what had been said about the Dayton incident. He came over, read the report, and violently disagreed with what had been decided upon as the answer. He said that he'd been working with radar before World War II. He'd helped with the operational tests on the first microwave warning radars developed early in the war by a group headed by Dr. Luis Alvarez. He said that what he saw on that radar scope was no ice cloud. It was some type of aircraft. He'd seen every conceivable type of weather target on radar, he told me. Thunderstorms, ice-laden clouds, targets caused by temperature inversions, and the works. They all had similar characteristics. The target was fuzzy and varied in intensity. But in this case, the target was a good, solid return, and he was convinced that it was caused by a good, solid object. And besides, he said, when the target began to fade on his scope, he had raised the tilt of the antenna and the target came back, indicating that whatever it was climbing. Ice-laden clouds don't climb, he commented rather bitterly. Nor did the pilot of one of the F-51s agree with the ATIC analysis. The pilot who had been leading the two-ship flight of F-51s on that day told me that what he saw was no planet. While he and his wingman were climbing, and before the clouds obscured it, they both got a good look at the UFO, and it was getting bigger and more distinct all the time. As they climbed, the light began to take on a shape. It was definitely round. And if it had been Venus, it should have been in the same part of the sky the next day, but the pilot said that he'd looked and it wasn't there. The ATIC report doesn't mention this point. I remember asking him a second time what the UFO looked like. He said, huge and metallic. Shades of the Mantell incident. Didn't get much of a play from the press because officially it wasn't an unknown, and there's nothing intriguing about an ice cloud and Venus. There were UFO reports in the newspapers, however. One story that was widely printed was about a sighting at the Naval Air Station at Dallas, Texas. Just before noon on March 16th, Chief Petty Officer Charles Lewis saw a disc-shaped UFO come streaking across the sky and buzz a high-flying B-36. Lewis first saw the UFO coming in from the north, lower than the B-36. Then he saw it pull up to the big bomber as it got closer. It hovered under the B-36 for an instant, then it went speeding off and disappeared. When the press inquired about the incident, Captain M.A. Nation, commander of the air station, vouched for his chief and added that the base tower operators had seen and reported a UFO to him about 10 days before. This story didn't run long because the next day a bigger one broke when the sky over the little town of Farmington, New Mexico, about 170 miles northwest of Albuquerque, was literally invaded by UFOs. Every major newspaper carried the story. The UFOs had apparently been congregating over the Four Corners area for 2 days, because several people had reported seeing UFOs on March 15th and 16th. But the 17th was the big day. Every saucer this side of Polaris must have made a successful rendezvous over Farmington, because on that day, most of the town's 3,600 citizens saw the mass flyby. The first reports were made at 10:15 a.m. Then for an hour, the air was full of flying saucers. Estimates of the number varied from a conservative 500 to thousands. Most all the observers said the UFOs were saucer-shaped, traveled at almost unbelievable speeds, and didn't seem to have any set flight path. They would dart in and out and seemed to avoid collisions only by inches. There was no doubt that they weren't hallucinations, because the mayor, the local newspaper staff, ex-pilots, the highway patrol, and every type of person who makes up a community of 3,600 saw them. I've talked to several people who were in Farmington and saw this now famous UFO display of St. Patrick's Day 1950. I've heard dozens of explanations: cotton blowing into the wind, bugs' wings reflecting sunlight, a hoax to put Farmington on the map, and real, honest-to-goodness flying saucers. One explanation was never publicized, however, and if there is an explanation, it is the best. Under certain conditions of extreme cold, probably 50 to 60 degrees below zero, the plastic bag of a skyhook balloon will get very brittle and will take on the characteristics of a huge light bulb. If a sudden gust of wind or some other disturbance hits the balloon, it will shatter into 1,000 pieces. As these pieces of plastic float down and are carried along by the wind, they could look like thousands of flying saucers. On St. Patrick's Day, a skyhook balloon launched from Automan Air Force Base, adjacent to the White Sands Proving Ground, did burst near Farmington, and it was cold enough at 60,000 feet to make the balloon brittle. True, the people at Farmington never found any pieces of plastic, but the small pieces of plastic are literally as light as feathers and could have floated far beyond the city. The next day, on March 18th, the Air Force, prodded by the press, shrugged and said, "There's nothing to it." But they had no explanation. True magazine came through for a third time when their April issue, which was published during the latter part of March 1950, carried a roundup of UFO photos. They offered 7 photos as proof that UFOs existed. It didn't take a photo interpretation expert to tell that all 7 could well be of doubtful lineage. Nevertheless, the collection of photos added fuel to the already smoldering fire. The U.S. public was hearing a lot about flying saucers, and all of it was on the pro side. For somebody who didn't believe in the things, the public thought that the Air Force was being mighty quiet. The subject took on added interest on the night of March 26th, when a famous news commentator said the UFOs were from Russia. The next night, Henry J. Taylor, in a broadcast from Dallas, Texas, said that the UFOs were Uncle Sam's own. He couldn't tell all he knew, but a flying saucer had been